Hey there, micro friends. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Micro. As always, I am so happy that you're here with me. And if this is the first time you're listening to Let's Talk Micro, well, thank you for making it one of your podcasts. I know there are many choices out there, so the fact that you are listening to this, I am very grateful for it. Well, okay, so in this episode, we do not have a guest, but we are still sharing some great content with you. So I hope you stay in and listen to this. And then I provided some links on the show notes where you can go and check out things in more detail. But, in this episode, this week, I just got back from Atlanta, where IDWeek was held, which is a yearly event from the Infectious Diseases Society of America, which is IDSA, the Society for Healthcare Epidemiology of America, which is SHEA or SHEA, the HIV Medicine Association, the Pediatrics Infectious Diseases Society, and the Society of Infectious Diseases Pharmacists, or SIDP. And maybe those of you that have been listening for a while, you know that I did a recap episode when I attended IDWeek 2023 in Boston. So this year I'm doing one as well. And just to give some context, this meeting, if you think about it in terms of microbiology, if you have been maybe to Microbe, which is the main event from the American Society for Microbiology. So every year, right, there are conferences, posters, presentations, and things like that. So this is the same thing for IDWeek. Keeping in mind that you have different professionals, right, from different parts of the infectious diseases microbiology realm. So some of the topics, unlike microbe, you have some topics on prescription, on pharmacy and things like that. So it's a broader spectrum. Okay, so before I jump into the highlights, one thing that I want to mention, last year, Microbe was held in Atlanta, like in the same venue in the Georgia World Congress Center. And this is not a criticism, but I think this is something that IDWeek did really well, which is, I don't know if you have been to that center, the Congress Center in Atlanta, but there are 3 buildings. And, last year we had meetings on building A, building B, a lot of them concentrating on B, but still, you had, the 3rd floor, 2nd floor, 1st floor. The exhibitions are all the way at the bottom. So there was a lot of walking. And I think that this year, IDWeek, they concentrated most of their events on building B, which was really good because, it reduces the time that you have to walk to each event. And at the end of the day, if you have dress shoes on, your feet hurt. So I think that this is, a huge shout out to IDWeek because they organized this very well. And something else was that you could really see, like how different companies, they sponsor the events. You could really see that presence, around. You could see like a lot of posters and things, about different antibiotics, pharmaceuticals and things like that. So you could really see that this year. But anyway, I just wanted to say that, and let's jump into the highlights. So today I'm walking you through the sessions and posters that really stood out. From next generation sequencing and AI to new antimicrobials and even some underused antibiotics. So if you couldn't make it to Atlanta this year, don't worry, you're coming with me. And there's so much material and you could do so many episodes because there were so many presentations, right? That's always one of the things when you go to these conferences, you have to pick and choose. You can't do everything you want ideally. So bear that in mind. So in the interest of time, I kind of condensed this episode in the presentations, and then at the same time while I'm going through them, I'm mentioning some posters that I saw. So that's kind of the flow we're having for this thing. So hey, let's get started. So one of the highlights of this year was, diagnostics stewardship and next generation sequencing, right? If you're in microbiology, you keep hearing about gene sequencing and how this keeps growing and organisms have been identified by gene sequencing. And of course, just like other tests that we do in the lab, right? There has to be some stewardship about this, when it comes to diagnostics and antimicrobials. So one of the most practical sessions was called Maximizing Impact Micro ID Partnerships in Diagnostic Stewardship of NGS Tests. So as part of this talk, Dr. Yang and Dr. Kaur from the University of California, Los Angeles, they review over 1,000 Karius plasma cell-free DNA tests. And they found that only about 16% had a positive clinical impact. But when ordering was limited to infectious disease specialists, that number nearly doubled. And with that, I mean the number of tests that had a clinical impact. And then over Children's Healthcare of Atlanta and Emory University, Dr. Mark Gonzalez and Dr. Catherine Goggin, they shared their own diagnostic stewardship approach. And this is every carrier's order gets reviewed by an ID team, infectious diseases, and that step alone improved yield while cutting unnecessary testing. And what is the takeaway from this? Well, when it comes to metagenomic, next generation sequencing, this is a powerful adjunct tool, but not a rule out test. And it works best when labs and clinicians partner closely. So just like other tests, in the lab, they have to be used responsibly. It involves some communication from appropriate teams, right? From the lab that's doing it, the infectious diseases, pharmacists and physicians, that communication and that stewardship, has to be done to maximize the efficacy of these tests. And the main important thing, right, is that we actually contribute to the benefit of the patient and the community, right? Especially when we're thinking about things like antibiotics. So responsible use. And in the interest of time, if you work in microbiology, I'm sure that you have heard of the Caries test. And maybe if you haven't, I invite you to go to a search engine and research it. Definitely in the lab, you at some point in time, you might have sent out a sample to do that. Okay, so moving on to posters. This one, it's a little bit related. I mean, it's not about gene sequencing or anything like that, but it is about talking about PCR and gene sequencing and things like that. This one is about the CARBA-R test. And if you work in a microlab, once again, I'm sure you work with this, but this is a test that we use for carbapenem-resistant Enterobacterales, and then we use this test to, detect genes that confer resistance to carbapenems. And this is some of the 5 most common genes, as you know, and in the test, we test for like NDM, OXA48, KPC, VIM, and IMP. So in this poster that I saw, this is from the Wadsworth Center at the New York State Department of Health, and their group showed that rectal swabs used for the Cepheid Expert CARBA-R assay remain stable for several days, even at room temperature. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump to the next highlight, and this is about new antimicrobials in the pipeline, right? I always have to talk about this. I enjoy learning. I enjoy sharing this information with you. So here we go. So, and as I mentioned before, with this type of meeting, you have so many things happening at the same time. So this particular session that I'm talking about, I could not attend. And when I went to look it up on the website and do some research for the episode, I found it very interesting, first of all. So I could not retrieve the slides associated with the presentation, to talk to you about it. But I did find like a release that was done last month. And I found this very interesting. So this is from Meiji Seika Pharma Company. And the speaker was Dr. Okade. And he presented results for nacubactam, which is also known as OP0595. And this is a new beta-lactamase inhibitor that has triple action. So it blocks beta-lactamases, it targets penicillin binding protein 2, and boosts partner beta-lactams like cefepime or astronam. And there was a phase 3 trial, which is the phase 3 Integral 1 trial, where it was just as effective as imipenem, cilastatin for complicated UTIs. And there's a follow-up study which is Integral 2 and is now testing it against carbapenem-resistant Enterobacterales. And as always, this is very fascinating because by now you know that this is like a recurring theme when you have beta-lactamase inhibitors, and then you couple them with a beta-lactam, and then these inhibitors, they allow that beta-lactam drug, to be more effective, or they restore the effect of it. And one of these examples, that you saw that it's now trending, as they say, is this drug Emblevio, which is, astronam-avibactam. And those of you that work in the lab, you know that before, we have ceftazidime avibactam. And then when we're doing synergy tests with that and astronam, because astronam has activity against metallo-beta-lactamases. But then if the organism is producing another beta-lactamase, then it has trouble. So by coupling them together, the avibactam then gives it a chance to work. So I'm definitely interested in learning more about this, nacubactam and doing more research about it. So this was a very interesting talk. And then walking through the poster hall, this is some of the things that I saw that I wanted to share with you. From the Hartford Healthcare in Connecticut, sulbactam durlobactam active against Acinetobacter baumannii. From Roche and Element Biosciences, sozurabulpin, a first-in-class antibiotic targeting LPS transport. Also from Hartford Healthcare, NDM, study showing enzyme persistence even under zinc-limited conditions. And then from Vanderbilt University Medical Center, there was a poster about a novel topoisomerase inhibitor active against fluoroquinolone-resistant Bacillus anthracis. And this had a nanomolar level potency even in resistant strains. So very fascinating. So if you're getting back from IDWeek and you register, go online and check out the posters. Okay, so let's move on to the next highlight, which is blood culture contamination, impactful or inconvenient. And in this session, Dr. Erica Prochaska from Johns Hopkins University discussed blood culture contamination in high-risk populations like premature infants and burn patients. She showed that standardized collection and stewardship algorithms drop unnecessary antibiotics by over 60%. And this is something that's always so interesting, right? We work in the lab, we do tests, we put results out there, but you don't know much about, what's been prescribed, what the patient is on, is it necessary, right? So learning about those things on the other side is always fascinating to me. And then Dr. Michelle Schenkel from Amsterdam University Medical Center showed contamination rates from 6.6 to 17% across hospitals, emphasizing how false positive drive over treatment. And when it comes to the posters, this one was very interesting. This is from St. Joseph Candler Health System in Georgia. So in this poster, they talk about removing a yeast comment from urine reports. And this, this yeast comment that was removed reduced fluconazole use by 71%. And that, my friends, is diagnostic stewardship at its best. Okay, so moving on to the next highlight, which is AI in clinical microbiology. And of course, guys, we have to talk about AI. By now, this is a trending topic. And this conference was no exception. So one of the talks was Dr. Anisha Misra from the Cleveland Clinic, and she discussed how AI has evolved in microbiology. And she talked about things like Mycin and GPT-style tools, and she gave some examples. And one of them was, that GPT-4 alone, scored around 71% on clinical micro questions, but then jumped to 90% when paired with curated references. And she used this great example, I think she said about before you study for your boards and after and for the lab, right? Before you take MLS classes or before you take your ASCP and after. That's like gauging your knowledge, right? So once you had a chance to study, right, and then you prepared and you have that repetition, right, you will do better and you do well in your exams. But before you start all that, right, maybe you're not gonna do that well. So that was the same with ChatGPT. Initially they were asked questions, right, and then it scored like a 71%. And then after you started like educating it, right, bringing in more things, then it scored higher. And then there was Dr. John Rossen from the University Medical Center in Groningen, which is in the Netherlands, and he discussed AI predicting antimicrobial susceptibility testing directly from genome sequencing, reducing turnaround by up to 70 hours. And his Dragon project combines long-read sequencing and cloud-based AI. This is something very fascinating, very interesting, so if you're registered to IDWeek, look him up, John Rossen, Rossen, and then also do some research on him. His talk is there on the IDWeek website, and if you register for it and then I invite you to do some additional research and find out more about this. This is definitely very interesting. And the takeaway from this is that AI is not replacing us. It's joining the team and still needs our supervision. And this is something that you see when it comes to like maybe some AI software that you're implementing, where it takes pictures of organisms, let's say, and then it shows them to you. A human still has to look at them and make sure that it makes sense and approve them. The same thing, let's say if you're using ChatGPT for any reason, right? And I'm sure that by now, most of us use it in some form or another, whether, I find it that it's very helpful. For example, ChatGPT, when I'm going to send an email or a communication, I want to make sure the tone is right? I'm sure that some of you have experienced this, that sometimes you're reading an email and maybe the tone that you're getting is that the person is angry. But then when you talk to them person to person, in person, that's not the case. So sometimes you want to do things like tweak the tone or things like that, but you still have to make sure that it makes sense. So if you're using it for that, for maybe like summarizing an article or something like that, you still have to make sure that at the end, right, you read everything and say, okay, this makes sense. I can go ahead and use it. Okay, and then moving on to the next highlight, and this was more about something that I noticed like a talk. And this is about underused antibiotics, and it just jumped at me because it's something that I don't see quite often. So Tedizolid, which is Tedizolid, and I know I did an episode about linezolid. So in this talk, Dr. Wendy Drummond from Providence Portland Medical Center highlight Tedizolid, which is a newer oxazolidinone, more potent than linezolid, with less myelosuppression and once daily dosing. Clinical data shows how, a strong efficacy in bone and joint infections, but the cost remains a barrier. Okay, and then just kind of bringing this to an end, and as I said before, there's so much information. So if you register for IDWeek, go to the website and check out these things in more detail. There are videos where you can listen to them in more detail. And then there's also the opportunity to doing additional research. So I invite you to do that. So some of these posters were from the New York Presbyterian Hospital. Minocycline MICs correlated with outcomes in Stenotrophomonas maltophilia infections. From the University of Kentucky, cefiderocol-based combos restore activity against Stenotrophomonas maltophilia. From Wayne State University, ABIF mutations linked to phage resistance in MRSA. And then from the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, citrus silver nasal swabs reduce MSSA colonization by over 97%. But going back to the one for the Stenotrophomonas and the MICs, that was very interesting, and their study they evaluated to see whether, poorer clinical outcomes were associated with higher MICs, and that's what the study showed, that the outcomes were worse when the MICs were higher. So very interesting. Well, friends, and that was the summary. So I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, I enjoy sharing this information with you, and I hope that you really enjoy IDWeek. I really did. And I invite you to go ahead and if you register, go ahead and check out this information in more detail. But I think this is very interesting, from my perspective in the lab. And there's so much material, as I said before, so I'm hoping that from this, reach out to some people and do some episodes so I can do things in more detail. But for now, trying to be conscious of your time, I'm making this highlight short. Okay, so as always, you can find Let's Talk Micro on any podcast platform. So if you go to Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, Good Pods, you can find us there. So I invite you to subscribe to the podcast, download episodes, and if the app allows you to do so, please leave a review. That's very important, and I am thankful for your support. And you can find us in socials. If you go to TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and Blue Sky Social, there you can find us as Let's Talk Micro, on X as Let's Talk Micro 1, LinkedIn as Luis Plaza. There's the website letstalkmicro.com, where you can find episode updates, you can find content about studying for your boards, information like that. So I invite you to subscribe to that as well. And if you have any feedback, any suggestions, you can always send those to letstalkmicro@outlook.com. If you wish to support the podcast in any way, you can do so via Venmo or via Buy Me a Coffee. KOFI, and both links are available on the show notes. And if you're looking to learn more about antibiotics, please check out www.learnantibiotics.com and the Learn Antibiotics book available on Amazon. These resources include cheat sheets, practice tests, games, and more, and they are being used by thousands of people worldwide and may be helpful for you or your colleagues. And as always, these are some great resources from Dr. Timothy Gauthier, a very passionate pharmacist. And of course, the Let's Talk Micro podcast is supported by the American Society for Microbiology. To learn more about microbes, visit asm.org. And that, my dear audience, it's the end of this episode. I hope you enjoy learning about the highlights from IDWeek, and I invite you to check out this conference in the future if you haven't already. As always, I enjoy sharing this information with you. So stay tuned, great things coming your way. The next episode of the partnership with bioMérieux is coming soon, so hang in there. Thank you for your support. Thank you for downloading episodes. Thank you for everything. So please continue bringing that passion to what you do. It's so important. You do such great work. So, as always, stay motivated, stay safe, and of course, continue talking micro. Until the next time. Bye.